I never imagined that the satisfying hum of my pottery kiln would become the most controversial sound in my entire neighborhood. But here I was, standing in my garage-turned-studio with a cease and desist order clutched in my trembling hands while the HOA president glared at me from my driveway like I had committed some unspeakable crime against humanity. My name is Jason Garrett, and I have been living in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision in Scottsdale, Arizona for the past 6 years. The neighborhood is one of those meticulously planned communities where every house looks vaguely similar. The lawns are measured for compliance, and apparently, creativity is viewed with deep suspicion. I work as a software developer during the day, but my real passion has always been ceramics. 3 years ago, I converted half of my 2-car garage into a proper pottery studio, complete with a wheel, shelving for drying pieces, and most importantly, a professional-grade electric kiln that I saved up for months to purchase. The kiln itself was a beauty, a Scut KM1027 that could reach temperatures up to 2,350 degrees Fahrenheit. It ran on a 240-volt circuit that I had a licensed electrician install, complete with all the proper permits from the city of Scottsdale. Everything was done by the book, inspected, and approved. I had been firing pieces 2 or 3 times a month for nearly 3 years without a single problem. My pottery had even started selling on Etsy, bringing in a nice side income that helped offset my mortgage payments. Then, Patricia Donnelly moved into the neighborhood. Patricia was exactly what you would picture when someone says the word Karen out loud. She was in her late 40s, had that distinctive asymmetrical blonde haircut that seemed to be issued along with HOA board positions, and she wore athleisure outfits that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Within 2 months of moving into the house, 3 doors down from mine, she had gotten herself elected as the HOA president, replacing the previous president who had been a generally reasonable guy named Tom. The first time I met Patricia was at a mandatory HOA meeting that I almost skipped. She introduced herself with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes and immediately launched into a presentation about maintaining property values and ensuring community standards. I should have recognized the warning signs then, but I was too busy thinking about the large serving bowl I had in the kiln that needed to be unloaded the next morning. The trouble started on a Wednesday evening in March. I had loaded the kiln with a full batch of mugs and bowls, programmed the firing schedule, and started the cycle around 6 in the evening. The firing would take approximately 12 hours, meaning it would finish around 6 the next morning, and then I would let it cool for another 12 hours before unloading. This was my standard routine, one I had followed dozens of times before. At 8:30 that evening, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Patricia standing there with her phone held out in front of her, clearly recording me. "Can I help you?" I asked, confused by the camera. "I am documenting a noise complaint," she said in a tone that suggested she was reading from a script. "Your garage is emitting a constant humming sound that is disturbing the peaceful enjoyment of my property." I blinked at her. "That's my kiln. It is firing pottery. It is not any louder than a refrigerator." "It is creating a nuisance," Patricia insisted. "I have measured the decibels from my property and it exceeds acceptable levels for a residential area." "Did you actually measure it, or are you just guessing?" I asked, my patience already wearing thin. "I do not appreciate your tone, Mr. Garrett," she said, her face flushing slightly. "As HOA president, it is my duty to investigate all complaints about property use violations." "Did someone complain, or is this you complaining?" I asked directly. She hesitated for just a second too long. "That is confidential HOA business." "Right," I said. "Well, my kiln is legally installed, properly permitted through the city, and it is inside my garage. I am not violating any city ordinances or HOA rules." "We will see about that," Patricia said, and then she turned and walked back down my driveway, still holding her phone up like she was filming a documentary about suburban warfare. I closed the door and tried to shake off the encounter. My wife, Olivia Zimmerman, who I had married 4 years ago and who had kept her last name for professional reasons, came down the stairs looking concerned. "What was that about?" she asked. "New HOA president has a problem with my kiln," I said. Olivia rolled her eyes. "You are kidding. You have been running that thing for years." "Apparently that does not matter to Patricia Donnelly," I said. "Ignore her," Olivia advised. She cannot do anything. You have all the permits." I wish I had been as confident as my wife sounded. The next morning, I woke up to find an official-looking letter stuck to my front door with tape. It was printed on HOA letterhead and signed by Patricia in her capacity as president. The letter informed me that my industrial kiln operation was in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA covenants, which prohibited home-based businesses that create noise, odor, or traffic disturbances to neighboring properties. I read the letter 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rise with each pass. The kiln was not industrial. It was a standard studio kiln. My pottery business was barely a business at all, just some online sales that maybe brought in a few $100s a month. And there was no traffic, no customers coming to my house, nothing that would disturb anyone. I immediately pulled out my copy of the HOA covenants, the thick document that I had admittedly never read all the way through when we bought the house. I found Section 12, Paragraph 4, and read it carefully. It did indeed prohibit home businesses that created disturbances, but the language was vague and seemed designed to prevent things like auto repair shops or dog kennels, not a single person making pottery in their garage. I called the HOA management company that handled the administrative work for Meadowbrook Hills. A bored-sounding woman named Sandra answered and listened to my explanation. "So the HOA president is claiming your pottery studio violates the covenants," she said. "Yes, but it does not create any real disturbance," I explained. "The kiln is quiet, there's no smell, no customers. I just make pottery for personal enjoyment and occasional online sales." "Do you have a business license?" Sandra asked. "Yes, through the city of Scottsdale," I said. "It is a home occupation permit." "Well, that might be your problem right there," Sandra said. "If you have a business license, then it is technically a business, which means the HOA can regulate it under the covenants." "But the covenants only prohibit businesses that create disturbances," I argued. "That is up to the HOA board to determine," Sandra said in a tone that made it clear she did not want to get involved. "You can request a hearing to appeal any enforcement actions." "What enforcement actions?" I asked. "I do not know. You would have to ask the president about that," Sandra said, and then made an excuse to get off the phone. I spent the rest of the morning fuming and researching HOA law in Arizona. What I found was not encouraging. HOAs in Arizona had broad authority to interpret and enforce their covenants, and while homeowners could sue if they believed the HOA was acting improperly, it was expensive and time-consuming. The legal advice I found online all said the same thing. Try to work it out with the HOA first before escalating. So I decided to be the bigger person. I sent Patricia a polite email explaining that my pottery studio was fully permitted by the city, created minimal noise, and had been operating without complaint for 3 years. I offered to show her the studio in the kiln so she could see for herself that it was not some industrial operation. Her response came 2 hours later. "Dear Mr. Garrett, the HOA board has reviewed your situation and determined that your kiln operation must cease immediately. You have 48 hours to comply. Failure to do so will result in fines of $100 per day. Sincerely, Patricia Donnelly, HOA President." I showed the email to Olivia when she got home from her job as a dental hygienist. "She cannot do that," Olivia said immediately. "Can she?" "Apparently she thinks she can," I said. "What are you going to do?" Olivia asked. "I am going to fire my kiln," I said. "I have 3 custom orders that need to be finished this week, and I am not going to let Patricia Donnelly destroy my livelihood over some petty power trip." That night, I loaded the kiln and started another firing cycle. It felt defiant and slightly reckless at the same time, like I was a teenager sneaking out after curfew. The kiln hummed to life, beginning its 12-hour journey to cone 6, the temperature needed for my mid-range glazes to mature properly. I half expected Patricia to show up again, but the evening passed without incident. The next morning, I unloaded beautiful pieces from the kiln, the glazes having transformed in the heat from dull, chalky surfaces to glossy, vibrant finishes. This was why I loved ceramics, the magical transformation that happened inside that heated box. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a notice of fine, $300 for 3 days of non-compliance with the cease and desist order. The letter informed me that the fines would continue to accumulate at $100 per day until I permanently shut down my kiln operation. "This is insane," I said to Olivia as we sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter. "We cannot afford $100 a day in fines." "We need to get a lawyer," Olivia said. "Do you know how much lawyers cost?" I asked. "We would spend thousands fighting this." "What is the alternative?" Olivia asked. "You just give up your pottery? Something you love?" I did not have a good answer to that. The following week, I attended the monthly HOA board meeting, which was held in the clubhouse of our community. About 20 homeowners showed up, most of them looking as thrilled to be there as I felt. Patricia sat at the front table with two other board members, a retired accountant named Donald Sherman and a yoga instructor named Michelle Hayes. Both of them seemed perfectly content to let Patricia run the show. When the meeting opened for homeowner comments, I raised my hand. "Jason Garrett, 428 Sage Creek Drive," I said when Patricia acknowledged me with a tight nod. "I am here to appeal the fines and cease and desist order regarding my pottery studio." "Your appeal is noted," Patricia said. "The board will review it and provide a response within 30 days as required by the bylaws." 30 days? I said. "That is another $3,000 in fines." "The fines accumulate until compliance is achieved," Patricia said primly. "That is the policy." "What exactly am I not in compliance with?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "I have all city permits. My kiln meets all electrical and safety codes. It operates inside my garage. There is no noise, no smell, no traffic." "You are operating a commercial business in violation of the residential covenants," Patricia said. "It is barely a business," I said. "I sell some pieces online. That is it. Lots of people in this neighborhood have home businesses. Sarah down the street does pampered chef parties. Mike sells insurance from his home office. Why is my pottery different?" "Those businesses do not require industrial equipment," Patricia said. "It is not industrial equipment," I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts. "It is a studio kiln. It is designed for home use." "Mr. Garrett, you are out of order," Patricia said. "If you cannot control yourself, I will have you removed from this meeting." I looked around at the other homeowners, hoping for some support, but most of them were staring at their phones or looking uncomfortable. No one wanted to get involved, which I understood, but still found frustrating. I sat down, defeated for the moment. After the meeting, an older woman approached me in the parking lot. Her name was Helen Morris, and she had lived in Meadowbrook Hills since the neighborhood was first built 12 years ago. "I'm sorry about what is happening to you," Helen said. "Patricia has been on a power trip ever since she became president. She fined me $200 last month because my rose bushes were 6 inches too tall according to her interpretation of the landscaping rules." "This is crazy," I said. "Does no one push back against her?" "Most people just pay the fines and move on," Helen said. "It is easier than fighting. But you should know, there is a recall process in the bylaws. If enough homeowners sign a petition, we can force a vote to remove a board member." "How many signatures?" I asked. 20% of the homeowners," Helen said. "So about 45 signatures out of the 224 homes." That seemed doable, but also time-consuming, and I did not have time with fines accumulating daily. When I got home, I found another letter taped to my door. This one was even more aggressive than the previous notices. It informed me that if I did not comply within 7 days, the HOA would seek legal action to obtain a court order forcing me to shut down my kiln operation permanently. I crumpled the letter in my fist and went inside. Olivia was working a late shift, so I was alone with my thoughts and my anger. I went out to the garage and looked at my studio, the space I had built with my own hands, the shelves I had installed, the work table I had constructed from reclaimed wood, the kiln that represented months of saving and planning. The idea of giving it all up because of Patricia's vendetta made me feel physically ill. I pulled out my phone and started searching for lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes. Most of them had consultation fees of several $100s just to discuss the case, and their hourly rates ranged from $200 to $400. I did some quick math and realized that fighting this legally could easily cost $10,000 or more, with no guarantee of success. Then I had a different idea. I went back inside and found the folder where I kept all my paperwork related to the studio. I pulled out the home occupation permit that the city of Scottsdale had issued me 3 years ago. I had applied for it when I first started selling pottery online, figuring it was better to do things properly from the start. The permit specifically allowed me to operate a home-based art studio, including the use of a kiln, as long as I met certain requirements. No employees other than family members, no customers coming to the residence, no external signs advertising the business, and compliance with all building and electrical codes. I had met all those requirements. The city had inspected my electrical work and approved it. I had no signs. No customers ever came to my house. Everything was sold and shipped through Etsy and art fairs. By the city's standards, I was a model home-based business. The next morning, I called the city's code enforcement office and explained my situation to a man named Robert who seemed genuinely interested in helping. "So the HOA is claiming you are violating their covenants, but you have a valid home occupation permit from the city?" Robert asked. "Exactly," I said. "Well, here's the thing," Robert said. "HOA covenants cannot override city ordinances. If the city has given you a permit to operate your studio, the HOA cannot simply ban it. They can regulate things like noise levels and hours of operation, but they cannot completely prohibit an activity that the city has approved." "Are you sure about that?" I asked, feeling a surge of hope. "Pretty sure," Robert said, "but you should probably talk to a lawyer to confirm. Arizona law does give HOAs a lot of power, but it is not unlimited. There was actually a state law passed a few years ago that specifically protects home-based businesses from overly restrictive HOA rules." After I hung up with Robert, I spent the next several hours researching Arizona revised statutes related to HOAs and home-based businesses. What I found was exactly what Robert had referenced. Arizona Revised Statute 33-1261 prohibited HOAs from completely banning home-based businesses that were properly licensed and did not create significant disturbances. I printed out the relevant sections of the law and highlighted the key passages. Then, I drafted a formal response to the HOA, citing the statute and my city-issued permit. I explained that while the HOA could reasonably regulate my studio to prevent disturbances, they could not order it shut down completely. I sent the letter via certified mail to Patricia and the HOA management company. The response came faster than I expected. 2 days later, I received a phone call from a lawyer representing the HOA. His name was Gregory Mitchell, and he had the smooth, condescending tone of someone who was used to intimidating people. "Mr. Garrett, I'm calling on behalf of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA," he said. "Your recent letter contains several inaccuracies regarding Arizona HOA law, and I wanted to clarify the situation before this escalates further." "What inaccuracies?" I asked. "The statute you cited does allow home-based businesses, but it includes an important exception," Gregory said. "The HOA can still enforce covenants that were in place before that law was passed. Meadowbrook Hills' covenants predate the statute, which means the HOA retains full authority to regulate or prohibit home businesses." "That does not sound right," I said, though I was not entirely sure. "I assure you it is correct," Gregory said. "Furthermore, even if the statute did apply, your operation could still be prohibited because it creates a disturbance. The president has documented noise complaints." "From who?" I asked. "The only person who's complained is Patricia herself, and she lives 3 houses away. My immediate neighbors have no problem with it." "That is irrelevant," Gregory said. "A single complaint is sufficient grounds for enforcement under the covenants." "This is ridiculous," I said. "I have a legal city permit." "Your city permit does not override the HOA covenants," Gregory said. "Those are 2 separate legal frameworks. The city regulates building codes and zoning. The HOA regulates use of property within the subdivision. They do not conflict. They simply operate in parallel." "So you are saying the city can give me permission to do something, but the HOA can still forbid it?" I asked. "Exactly," Gregory said. "And if you continue to operate your kiln, the HOA will file for a court injunction. You will be responsible for the HOA's legal fees in addition to your own, and you will still have to shut down. My advice is to comply now and save yourself a lot of money and stress." He hung up before I could respond. I sat there feeling defeated. Everything Gregory said might be true, or it might be a bluff designed to scare me into giving up. but I had no way to know without spending thousands on my own lawyer. That evening, I told Olivia about the phone call. "Maybe we should just move," she said quietly. "Find a house that is not in an HOA." "We cannot afford to move right now," I said. "We would lose money selling this place, and we do not have enough saved for another down payment." "Then what are we going to do?" Olivia asked. "I do not know," I admitted. The fines continued to accumulate. Each week brought another letter detailing how much I owed. After a month, the total was over $3,000. After 2 months, it was over $6,000. I stopped opening the letters. I also stopped using my kiln. It sat cold and dark in my garage, a constant reminder of what I had lost. My Etsy orders piled up unfulfilled until I eventually had to close the shop and refund everyone's money. The income was not huge, but losing it hurt both financially and emotionally. Olivia suggested I look into renting studio space somewhere, but the cheapest option I could find was $800 a month, which was more than we could afford, especially with the HOA fines hanging over our heads. I fell into a depression that I tried to hide from Olivia, but she could tell. I came home from my software job and sat in the garage staring at my pottery wheel, running my hands over clay that I would never be able to fire. 3 months after the initial cease and desist order, I received a notice that the HOA had filed a lawsuit against me in Maricopa County Superior Court. They were seeking a permanent injunction against operating my kiln, plus payment of all accumulated fines, plus their attorney fees, which they claimed were already over $12,000. The total amount they were suing me for was just over $22,000. I showed the lawsuit to Olivia, and she burst into tears. "We do not have that kind of money," she said. "If they win, we will have to sell the house." "I know," I said. "This is not fair," Olivia said. "You did not do anything wrong." "Apparently that does not matter," I said. I knew I needed a lawyer, but I could not afford the ones I had consulted with earlier. Instead, I reached out to a legal aid organization that helped people with civil disputes. After explaining my situation, they connected me with a young attorney named Marcus Chen, who sometimes took HOA cases pro bono if he thought they had merit. Marcus came to my house the following week. He was in his early 30s, full of energy, and seemed genuinely outraged when I showed him all the documentation. "This is exactly the kind of abuse of power that gives HOAs a bad name," Marcus said, after reviewing everything. "You have a legitimate city permit. Your kiln meets all codes. You're not creating any real disturbance. The HOA president clearly has a personal vendetta against you." "Can we win?" I asked. "Maybe," Marcus said. "The law is somewhat ambiguous, which is why the HOA thinks they can get away with this, but I think we have a strong argument that they are overstepping their authority." "What will it cost?" I asked. "I will take the case pro bono," Marcus said. "But you need to understand that even if we win, it could take a year or more to resolve, and there is no guarantee. Courts generally defer to HOAs unless there is clear evidence of discrimination or abuse." "A year?" I said. "Civil cases move slowly," Marcus said, "but I will do my best to expedite it." I agreed to let Marcus represent me, mostly because I had no other options. He filed a response to the HOA's lawsuit, denying all their claims and filing a counterclaim, arguing that the HOA was violating state law by attempting to prohibit a legally permitted home business. The case slowly ground through the court system. There were motions and counter-motions, discovery requests, depositions. Patricia gave a deposition where she claimed my kiln was a fire hazard and an industrial operation unsuitable for a residential neighborhood. Never mind that the fire department had inspected it and found it perfectly safe, or that it was specifically designed for home use. 6 months into the lawsuit, Marcus called me with unexpected news. I filed a motion to compel the HOA to produce all their records related to enforcement actions against other homeowners, Marcus said, "and you are not going to believe what I found." "What?" I asked. "The HOA has approved multiple home-based businesses over the past 5 years, Marcus said, including a woman who runs a baking business out of her kitchen selling cakes and cookies, another guy who repairs computers, someone else who does dog grooming in their garage. None of them were ever told they had to shut down." "So they are treating me differently?" I said. "It looks that way," Marcus said, "which suggests selective enforcement, which is a violation of fair housing laws. The HOA has to apply rules consistently. They cannot single you out just because Patricia does not like pottery. This felt like the first real break in the case. Marcus filed an amended complaint adding claims of selective enforcement and arguing that the HOA had waived its right to enforce the covenants by allowing so many other home businesses to operate. 2 weeks later, Patricia showed up at my door again. This time she did not have her phone out, and she looked less confident than before. "I wanted to talk to you about resolving this situation," Patricia said. "You should talk to my lawyer," I said. "I'm trying to help you," Patricia said. "If we go to trial, you are going to lose, and you will owe tens of thousands of dollars. But if you agree to shut down voluntarily, we can waive the fines and drop the lawsuit." "Why would you do that?" I asked suspiciously. "Because litigation is expensive for everyone," Patricia said. "The HOA would prefer to resolve this amicably." "You mean you are worried you are going to lose?" I said. Patricia's expression hardened. "You're not going to win, Mr. Garrett. The covenants are very clear. You should take the deal while it is on the table." "I will discuss it with my lawyer," I said, and closed the door. When I told Marcus about Patricia's visit, he laughed. "They are scared," he said. "The selective enforcement evidence is really damaging to their case. A judge is not going to look kindly on an HOA that allowed multiple home businesses but singled out pottery for some reason." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We push forward," Marcus said. "Unless you want to take their deal?" "No," I said firmly. "I want my studio back." "Good," Marcus said, "because I think we can win this." The trial date was set for September, nearly a year after the initial cease and desist order. In the meantime, my kiln sat unused, gathering dust in my garage. I tried to stay busy with my day job, but I felt a constant sense of loss. Pottery had been my creative outlet, my way of processing stress and finding balance in life. Without it, I felt diminished somehow. Olivia tried to stay positive, but I could tell the stress was wearing on her too. We talked about what would happen if we lost the case, whether we would have to declare bankruptcy or try to negotiate a payment plan with the HOA. 2 months before trial, Marcus called with more news. I have been doing more digging into Patricia's background," Marcus said, "and I found something interesting. Before she moved to Meadowbrook Hills, she lived in a condo in Tempe. She was on the board there too, and she was actually sued by one of the residents for harassment. The case was settled out of court, but the complaint alleged that Patricia had a pattern of targeting specific residents with enforcement actions while ignoring violations by her friends." "Can we use that in court?" I asked. "It is tricky because the case was sealed as part of the settlement," Marcus said, "but I have contacted the lawyer who represented the plaintiff in that case, and he is willing to testify about Patricia's behavior pattern without violating the settlement terms." This was potentially huge, evidence that Patricia had a history of using HOA authority to harass people she did not like. As the trial date approached, I became increasingly nervous. Marcus had prepared me for what to expect, the formal court procedures, the questions I would be asked, the need to stay calm and factual. But knowing what to expect did not make it less intimidating. The trial was held in a windowless courtroom in downtown Phoenix. Judge Margaret Sullivan presided, a stern-looking woman in her 60s who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense from either side. The HOA's attorney, Gregory Mitchell, presented their case first. He argued that the covenants clearly prohibited businesses that created disturbances, and my kiln qualified because it generated heat, noise, and potential safety hazards. He brought in Patricia as a witness, and she testified about the constant humming from my garage and her concerns about fire risk. When Marcus cross-examined Patricia, he methodically dismantled her credibility. "Mrs. Donnelly, you live 3 houses away from Mr. Garrett, is that correct?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Patricia said. "And how often have you actually been on Mr. Garrett's property to observe this alleged noise?" Marcus asked. "I do not need to be on his property," Patricia said. "I can hear it from my house." "But you have never actually been in his garage to see the kiln?" Marcus asked. "No," Patricia admitted. "So you do not actually know how loud it is or whether it creates any real disturbance?" Marcus asked. "I know it creates noise," Patricia insisted. Marcus then pulled up the documentation from the city showing that my kiln had been inspected and approved, meeting all safety codes. Are you aware that the Scottsdale Fire Department inspected Mr. Garrett's kiln and found it fully compliant with all safety regulations? Marcus asked. I am not a fire safety expert, Patricia said. But you testified that you had concerns about fire risk, Marcus said. Were those concerns based on any actual expertise, or were they just your personal opinion? Patricia's face flushed. I have a right to be concerned about safety in my neighborhood. Of course, Marcus said smoothly. But concerns are not the same as facts, are they? Gregory objected, claiming Marcus was badgering the witness, but Judge Sullivan overruled him. Marcus then brought up the evidence of selective enforcement, introducing documents showing that the HOA had approved or ignored multiple other home-based businesses. Mrs. Donnelly, are you aware that Sarah Chen at 612 Willow Lane operates a baking business from her home? Marcus asked. I believe she bakes occasionally, Patricia said carefully. She has a business license and sells goods commercially, Marcus said. Yet the HOA has never taken enforcement action against her. Why is that? Baking is different from operating industrial equipment, Patricia said. Commercial ovens can generate significant heat and consume substantial electricity, Marcus said. Why is that acceptable but a pottery kiln is not? It is just different, Patricia said weakly. Marcus continued hammering on the selective enforcement angle, bringing up 3 other examples of home businesses that had never been challenged. Gregory tried to argue that those businesses were different in nature, but it was clear that the HOA had not applied its rules consistently. The most damaging moment came when Marcus called Dr. Raymond Foster, the lawyer who had represented the plaintiff in the previous case against Patricia in Tempe. Dr. Foster, can you describe the nature of the complaint in the case you handled involving Mrs. Donnelly? Marcus asked. My client alleged that Mrs. Donnelly, acting in her capacity as a board member of their HOA, engaged in selective enforcement of rules, Dr. Foster said. Specifically, she would cite my client for minor violations while ignoring identical or worse violations by other residents. What was the outcome of that case? Marcus asked. It settled confidentially, Dr. Foster said, but part of the settlement required Mrs. Donnelly to resign from the board. This revelation caused visible surprise in the courtroom. Judge Sullivan looked interested, leaning forward slightly in her chair. Gregory tried to object, arguing that the previous case was irrelevant, but Judge Sullivan allowed the testimony to continue. When it was our turn to present our case, Marcus called me to the stand. I testified about my 3 years of operating the studio without complaint, my city permits, the professional installation of the electrical system, and the care I took to ensure everything was done properly. I explained that pottery was not just a hobby or a business for me, but a passion that had helped me cope with work stress and find creative fulfillment. Marcus also called my immediate neighbors to testify. Both Tom Rodriguez, who lived next door to me, and Barbara Franklin, who lived on the other side, testified that they had never heard any noise from my kiln and had no problems with my studio. I honestly did not even know Jason had a kiln until all this started, Barbara testified. It is quieter than my air conditioning unit. The trial lasted 3 days. At the end, both sides presented closing arguments. Gregory argued that HOAs needed the authority to enforce their covenants or property values would suffer. Marcus argued that the HOA had abused its authority by selectively targeting me while allowing similar activities by other residents. Judge Sullivan said she would issue a written decision within 30 days. Those 30 days were agonizing. I tried to go about my normal life, but the uncertainty hung over everything. Olivia and I talked endlessly about what we would do if we lost. We looked at bankruptcy attorneys and tried to figure out if we could negotiate a payment plan with the HOA. The decision came 28 days later. Marcus called me at work, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. We won, he said simply. What? I said, not quite believing it. Judge Sullivan ruled in our favor on almost everything, Marcus said. She found that the HOA violated Arizona law by attempting to prohibit a legally permitted home business. She also found that the selective enforcement was discriminatory and violated fair housing principles. The injunction against you is dismissed, all fines are voided, and the HOA has to pay your attorney fees. I felt like I might cry. So I can use my kiln again? You can use your kiln again, Marcus confirmed. When I got home that evening, Olivia met me at the door. Marcus had already called her with the news. She threw her arms around me, and we both stood there in the entryway just holding each other. "You did it," she said. "We did it," I corrected her. That night, I went out to the garage and opened the kiln for the first time in over a year. I cleaned out the dust that had accumulated, checked all the electrical connections, and ran a test cycle. The familiar hum filled the space, and I felt a wave of relief and joy that was almost overwhelming. The next morning, I started throwing pots again. My hands remembered the feel of the clay on the wheel, the rhythmic motion of pulling and shaping. I worked for hours, losing myself in the process, creating forms that would eventually be fired and glazed and transformed. A few days later, I received a copy of Judge Sullivan's full decision in the mail. I read through it carefully, savoring every paragraph. The judge had not minced words in her criticism of the HOA's actions. The court finds that the HOA's enforcement action against Mr. Garrett was arbitrary, selective, and motivated by personal animus rather than any legitimate concern about community standards, she wrote. HOAs serve an important function in maintaining property values and neighborhood harmony, but they do not have unlimited authority to regulate homeowners' lawful activities. When an HOA acts beyond the scope of its legitimate authority, particularly when doing so in a discriminatory manner, the courts must intervene. The decision also included a specific order that the HOA could not take any further enforcement action against my pottery studio as long as I maintained my city permit and complied with all applicable safety codes. I thought that would be the end of the story, but I was wrong. 2 weeks after the court decision, I received a letter from the HOA management company informing me that Patricia Donnelly had resigned as president. A special election was being held to fill the position, and Helen Morris, the woman who had talked to me after that first contentious board meeting, was running unopposed. Helen won the election easily, and one of her first acts as president was to propose revisions to the HOA covenants that would explicitly permit home-based businesses that complied with city regulations and did not create significant disturbances. The revised covenants were approved by a vote of the homeowners, with only a handful voting against. I also learned from Helen that several homeowners had complained to the HOA board about Patricia's behavior during her tenure, alleging that she had threatened them with fines over trivial matters and had created a hostile atmosphere in the neighborhood. Once Patricia resigned, people felt comfortable speaking up about their experiences. About a month after Patricia's resignation, I saw her putting a "for sale" sign in her yard. She moved out within 2 months, and I never saw her again. I felt a twinge of something, not quite sympathy but not satisfaction either, just a sense that the whole situation had been a waste of everyone's time and energy. My pottery business slowly rebuilt. I reopened my Etsy shop and started taking custom orders again. The year-long gap had cost me momentum, and many of my previous customers had found other potters, but I did not mind. I was just grateful to be working again. Olivia suggested I teach pottery classes from the garage, pointing out that the court decision and revised covenants would allow it. I considered the idea, but ultimately decided against it. I liked having the studio as my private space, a place where I could work without having to perform or instruct. 6 months after the court victory, I participated in a large art fair in downtown Phoenix. I set up a booth with my pottery, arranged on tables with careful attention to display. The fall weather was perfect, cool, and sunny, and the fair drew big crowds. On the second day of the fair, a woman stopped at my booth and picked up one of my mugs, examining it carefully. She turned it over to look at my maker's mark, a stylized JG that I carved into the bottom of each piece. "These are really nice," she said. "Did you make all of them?" "I did," I said. "I work from my home studio." "In Scottsdale?" she asked, reading the address on my business card. "That's right," I said. "I heard about you," she said. "You are the guy who fought the HOA." I blinked in surprise. "How did you hear about that?" "It was in the news," she said. "There was an article about HOA overreach and your case was mentioned. My husband and I are looking at buying a house in an HOA, and your story made us really think twice about it." "It was a difficult situation," I said diplomatically. "I bet," she said. She ended up buying 3 mugs and a serving bowl, paying with a credit card and asking me to wrap them carefully. After she left, I looked up the article she had mentioned on my phone. Sure enough, there was a piece in the Arizona Republic about HOA disputes, and my case was featured prominently. The article painted Patricia as an example of HOA boards that abused their authority, and it quoted Judge Sullivan's decision extensively. I felt oddly exposed seeing my story in print, but also validated. What had felt like a private nightmare was actually part of a larger pattern, and maybe by fighting back, I had helped establish a precedent that would protect other homeowners in similar situations. As the sun set on the second day of the art fair, I packed up my unsold pottery and calculated my earnings. I had done well, selling about 2/3 of what I had brought. More importantly, I had enjoyed the experience, talking to people about ceramics, explaining my process, and connecting with other artists. On the drive home, I thought about everything that had happened over the past year and a half. The stress and uncertainty, the financial strain, the feeling of powerlessness in the face of an unjust system, but also the support from Olivia, the dedication of Marcus Chen, the solidarity of neighbors like Helen Morris, and, ultimately, the vindication of the court decision. When I pulled into my driveway that evening, I sat in the car for a moment looking at my house. It was just a house, similar to every other house on the block, nothing special about the exterior. But inside that garage was my studio, the space where I created, where I transformed raw materials into functional art, where I found meaning and purpose beyond my day job. Patricia had tried to take that away from me, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because she could, or thought she could. The impulse to control others, to enforce conformity, to wield petty authority, it was a poison that infected too many HOAs and turned neighbors against each other. But Patricia had failed. The kiln was still there, still humming when I fired it, still transforming clay into ceramic. I was still making pottery, still building my small business, still finding joy in the creative process. Inside the house, Olivia was making dinner. I could smell garlic and tomatoes, probably her pasta sauce. I carried a box of pottery carefully into the garage and set it on my work table. Then I stood there for a moment, running my hand over the cool surface of the kiln. Tomorrow I would load it with a new batch of pieces, mugs, and bowls that I had thrown over the past week. I would program the firing schedule, press the start button, and listen as the elements heated up and the kiln began its work. And no one could stop me. Not Patricia, not the HOA, not anyone. The next several months passed peacefully. I settled back into my routine of working on pottery in the evenings and on weekends, firing the kiln every week or two, and slowly building my inventory for art fairs and online sales. The constant stress that had defined the previous year gradually faded, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of creative work. Helen Morris proved to be an excellent HOA president. She approached the role with common sense and fairness, focusing on actual problems like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events, rather than trying to micromanage every detail of people's lives. Under her leadership, the neighborhood felt more like a community than a police state. One evening in late spring, almost 2 years after the initial cease and desist order, I was working in my studio when someone knocked on the garage door, which I had opened to let in the cool evening air. I looked up to see a man in his early 40s standing there, looking a bit hesitant. "Are you Jason Garrett?" he asked. "I am," I said, wondering if this was somehow HOA-related trouble starting again. "My name is Paul Thompson," he said. "I live in a neighborhood in Mesa, and I'm having almost the exact same problem you had. The HOA is trying to shut down my woodworking shop. My lawyer found your case when researching precedents, and he suggested I talk to you." I gestured for Paul to come in, and we talked for over an hour. His situation was indeed very similar to mine. A new HOA board member with a vendetta, selective enforcement of covenants, threats of fines, and legal action. I told him about my experience, about Marcus Chen, about the importance of documenting everything and finding evidence of selective enforcement. The hardest part was just the uncertainty, I told Paul, not knowing if I would lose everything. But you have an advantage I did not have. My case created legal precedent in Arizona. Your lawyer can cite Judge Sullivan's decision. "Did it really take a whole year to resolve?" Paul asked. "More than a year," I said. "It was not easy. But in the end, it was worth it. Not just because I got to keep my studio, but because it established that HOAs cannot just arbitrarily shut down legal home businesses. Paul left with renewed determination, and I gave him Marcus Chen's contact information. A few months later, he emailed me to say that his HOA had backed down after his lawyer threatened to sue and cited my case. The HOA did not want to risk the same outcome, paying attorney fees and being publicly criticized by a judge. I realized that what had started as a personal nightmare had become something larger, a small but meaningful check on HOA overreach. My case was being cited by lawyers, mentioned in news articles, and helping other homeowners stand up for their rights. Around the same time, I got an email from a producer at a local news station asking if I would be interested in doing an interview about my experience. They were producing a segment about HOA disputes in Arizona and wanted to feature my story. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to relive the stress of that period, but Olivia encouraged me to do it. "People need to hear these stories," she said. "If it helps even one person avoid what we went through, it is worth it." So I agreed to the interview. A camera crew came to my house and filmed me working in my studio, talking about pottery and explaining what had happened with the HOA. The piece aired on the evening news, and I got dozens of emails and messages from people who had similar experiences or were currently fighting their own HOA battles. One message particularly touched me. It was from a woman named Jennifer who did digital art from her home office. Her HOA had tried to classify her work as a prohibited commercial activity, even though she never had clients visit and did everything remotely. After seeing my story, she fought back, citing my case and Arizona's laws protecting home-based businesses. The HOA dropped their enforcement action within a week. "You gave me the courage to stand up for myself," Jennifer wrote. "Thank you for not giving up." That message made all the stress and uncertainty of the past 2 years feel worthwhile. My pottery continued to evolve and improve. The forced year off, as painful as it had been, had given me time to think about my work and where I wanted to go with it. When I started making pottery again, I approached it with renewed purpose and creativity. I experimented with new glazes, tried different forms, and pushed myself to take risks I might not have taken before. I also started participating in more art fairs and local exhibitions. My work was accepted into a juried show at a gallery in downtown Phoenix, and several pieces sold at prices higher than I had ever charged before. The side income from pottery grew to the point where it was no longer negligible, bringing in over $1,000 some months. Olivia joked that I should quit my day job and become a full-time potter, but we both knew that was not realistic, at least not yet. The stability of my software job was important, especially given what we had been through. But it was nice to dream about the possibility and to see my creative work being valued and appreciated. 2 years after the court victory, on the anniversary of Judge Sullivan's decision, I did something I had been planning for a while. I created a large decorative platter about 18 inches in diameter with an intricate design carved into the surface. The design depicted a simple kiln with flames rising from it, surrounded by the words of the judge's decision. HO, as do not have unlimited authority to regulate homeowners' lawful activities. I fired the platter with a rich blue glaze that pooled in the carved lines, making the design stand out dramatically. When it came out of the kiln, it was one of the best pieces I had ever made, the kind of work that made all the hours of practice and failure worthwhile. I gave the platter to Marcus Chen as a thank you gift for representing me. When I delivered it to his office, he was genuinely moved. "This is incredible," Marcus said, holding it up to examine the detail. "I'm going to hang this in my office as a reminder of why I do this work." "You saved my studio," I said. "I can never thank you enough." "You saved your studio," Marcus corrected me. "I just helped. You are the one who refused to give up, who believed you were right even when everyone was telling you to quit. That takes real courage." We shook hands, and I left his office feeling grateful that there were people like Marcus in the world, people who would fight for what was right, even when it was not financially lucrative. Life gradually returned to something approaching normal. The pottery studio became just a natural part of our household routine again, not a source of stress or conflict. I fired the kiln whenever I needed to, the familiar hum blending into the background noise of the house. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to see what I was working on or to buy pieces as gifts. The studio became a positive presence in the neighborhood rather than a source of controversy. Helen Morris organized a neighborhood art show, inviting any residents who were artists or crafters to display their work in the community clubhouse. I participated along with a surprising number of other neighbors, painters and photographers, woodworkers and quilters. It turned out that our neighborhood was full of creative people who had been quietly pursuing their passions, and the art show gave us all a chance to share our work and connect with each other. The event was a huge success, drawing over 100 attendees and creating a genuine sense of community that had been missing during Patricia's tenure as HOA president. Several pieces sold, including 3 of my mugs and a large serving bowl. But more valuable than the sales were the connections I made with neighbors who I had barely known before. I learned that the guy 2 streets over was an accomplished landscape painter who had shows in galleries across the Southwest. The retired teacher down the block made intricate quilts that had won awards at national competitions. The accountant across from me built custom furniture in his garage workshop. We were all creating, all pursuing our passions, and none of us were bothering anyone else. That was what Patricia had never understood. Her vision of the neighborhood was one of rigid conformity. Every lawn exactly the same height, every house painted approved colors, no activities that might be even slightly different from the suburban norm. But the reality was that diverse, creative, interesting people make neighborhoods better, not worse. The quirks and passions and individual pursuits are what turn a collection of identical houses into an actual community. 3 years after the initial cease and desist order, I got an unexpected phone call from an attorney named Deborah Walsh. She was representing a man in Tucson who was being sued by his HOA for operating a home-based pottery studio. The situation was essentially identical to what I had experienced. I have been researching similar cases, and yours is the most relevant precedent I have found, Deborah said. Would you be willing to testify as an expert witness about your experience in the court's decision? I had never been an expert witness before, but I agreed to help. A month later, I drove down to Tucson and testified in a case that felt like watching my own story replay. The plaintiff was a retired art teacher named William, who had set up a small studio in his garage after retiring. His HOA had ordered him to shut it down, citing the same kinds of vague covenant language that Patricia had used against me. I testified about my experience, about the court's analysis of Arizona law, and about the importance of protecting legitimate home-based creative work. The judge in that case, a younger man named Judge Richardson, listened carefully to my testimony and asked thoughtful questions. 2 weeks later, Deborah called to tell me that Judge Richardson had ruled in William's favor, citing my case extensively and adopting much of Judge Sullivan's reasoning. William's studio was protected, and the HOA was ordered to pay his legal fees. You are creating a body of case law that is helping people across the state, Deborah told me. What started as your personal fight is now protecting other people's rights. That realization was profound. My struggle, painful as it had been, was having ripple effects I never could have imagined. Every time a lawyer cited my case, every time a judge referenced Judge Sullivan's decision, every time another homeowner successfully defended their right to pursue creative work, my fight mattered. Olivia and I talked about it one evening while sitting on our back patio, watching the Arizona sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Do you ever regret fighting it? Olivia asked, instead of just giving up and moving on. Never, I said without hesitation. It was hell while it was happening, but I could not live with myself if I had just let Patricia bully me into giving up something I loved. And now, seeing how it is helping other people, I know it was the right choice. I'm proud of you, Olivia said quietly. I could not have done it without you, I said. There were so many times I wanted to quit, but you kept believing we would win. She squeezed my hand, and we sat there in comfortable silence watching the colors fade from the sky. The years that followed were peaceful and productive. My pottery continued to improve and evolve. I developed a signature style, functional pieces with clean lines and rich layered glazes that had depth and complexity. My work started showing up in local boutiques and galleries, always with a card that said, "Made in Scottsdale, Arizona," in my home studio. I never forgot what I had learned during the fight with the HOA. I learned that standing up for yourself matters, even when it is hard and scary and expensive. I learned that unjust authority should be challenged, not accepted. I learned that there are good people in the world, lawyers like Marcus Chen and neighbors like Helen Morris, who will stand with you when things are difficult. Most importantly, I learned that creativity is worth fighting for. The act of making something with your hands, of transforming raw materials into objects of beauty and utility, is fundamentally human. Patricia had tried to take that away from me, had tried to reduce my passion to nothing more than a covenant violation, a disturbance to be eliminated. But she had failed. The kiln still hummed in my garage, still reached temperatures hot enough to transform clay into stone. My hands still shaped wet earth on the spinning wheel, still pulled and coaxed and formed. The creative fire inside me still burned, stronger than ever because I had fought to keep it alive. On a Saturday morning, 4 years after the initial cease and desist order, I was loading a kiln full of mugs when I heard someone walking up my driveway. I looked up to see a young couple, probably in their late 20s, standing there looking somewhat nervous. "Are you Jason Garrett?" the woman asked. "I am," I said, wiping clay dust off my hands. "We are so sorry to bother you," the man said. "But we just bought a house in a neighborhood with an HOA, and we read about your case online. I am a metal worker, and I'm worried the HOA might try to stop me from having a shop in my garage." I invited them in and spent an hour talking to them about my experience, about what they should do to protect themselves, about the importance of getting proper permits and documenting everything. I gave them Marcus Chen's contact information and encouraged them to have their HOA covenants reviewed by a lawyer before any problems arose. "The most important thing is to know your rights," I told them. "HOAs have power, but it is not unlimited. If you are doing something legal and reasonable, and you have the proper permits, they cannot just arbitrarily shut you down. My case established that in Arizona." They left, looking relieved and empowered, and I felt good about being able to help them avoid the nightmare I had experienced. As the years passed, I became something of an accidental advocate for homeowners' rights and the protection of home-based creative work. I gave talks at local arts organizations, spoke to homeowner groups, and even testified before a state legislative committee that was considering reforms to HOA regulations in Arizona. The pottery itself remained the center of everything. I never lost sight of why I had fought so hard, not to make a political point or to become an advocate, but simply to keep doing the work I loved. Every time I opened the kiln and saw the transformed pieces inside, glossy and vibrant and permanent, I felt that same sense of wonder and satisfaction that had drawn me to ceramics in the first place. My studio became a sanctuary, a place where I could escape the demands of the day job and the stress of daily life and just create. The rhythm of throwing on the wheel was meditative, the process of glazing required focus and attention, and the anticipation of opening the kiln after a firing never got old. Each piece was a small miracle, a collaboration between my intentions and the alchemy of heat and chemistry. Olivia sometimes joined me in the studio, not to make pottery herself, but just to sit and read while I worked. She said she found it peaceful, the sound of the wheel spinning and my hands working the clay. It became our quiet time together, no TV or phones or distractions, just the two of us sharing space while I created. 5 years after Judge Sullivan's decision, I received an invitation that surprised and honored me. The Arizona Craft Association was hosting a symposium on home-based arts businesses, and they wanted me to be one of the keynote speakers. The symposium would bring together artists, lawyers, and HOA professionals to discuss best practices for balancing homeowner rights with community standards. I accepted the invitation and spent weeks preparing my presentation. I wanted to tell my story, but more importantly, I wanted to convey the lessons I had learned and hopefully prevent other artists from going through what I had experienced. The symposium was held at a conference center in Phoenix on a bright Saturday in October. Over 200 people attended, A mix of artists who worked from home studios, HOA board members who wanted to learn how to handle these situations better, and lawyers who specialized in property law. My presentation was scheduled for the afternoon. I stood at the podium looking out at the audience, feeling nervous but determined to do justice to the story and its implications. 5 years ago, I received a letter telling me I had to shut down my pottery studio permanently, I began. The HOA president claimed I was violating neighborhood covenants by operating an industrial kiln. I had never had a complaint from any of my actual neighbors. I had all the proper permits from the city. I was not creating any real disturbance, but none of that mattered to the HOA president because she had decided that pottery did not belong in our neighborhood. I told the whole story, the escalating fines, the lawsuit, the year of uncertainty, and ultimately the court victory. I showed photos of my studio and my work, and I read excerpts from Judge Sullivan's decision. What I learned from this experience is that HOAs serve an important function, but they can also be abused by people who confuse authority with power, I said. The law in Arizona now clearly protects home-based businesses that are properly licensed and do not create genuine disturbances. But too many HOA board members do not know that, or they choose to ignore it, and too many homeowners do not know their rights, so they give up without fighting back. After my presentation, I took questions from the audience. Several HOA board members asked thoughtful questions about how to distinguish between legitimate home businesses and activities that really do create problems for neighbors. Artists asked about what documentation they should maintain and when they should consult a lawyer. One woman raised her hand and said, "I'm on my HOA board, and we recently received a complaint about someone working from home. After hearing your story, I realized we were about to make the same mistake. We are going to approach the situation differently now, actually talking to the homeowner and trying to understand what they are doing before jumping to enforcement." That comment made the whole presentation worthwhile. After the symposium ended, dozens of people came up to talk to me, to share their own stories, to ask for advice, or simply to say thank you for fighting and for sharing my experience. I exchanged contact information with many of them, forming connections that would last for years. The drive home from the symposium felt significant somehow, like I had completed a journey that started with Patricia's cease and desist letter and ended with me helping to educate and advocate for positive change. My personal nightmare had been transformed into something constructive, maybe even important. That evening, I went out to my studio and threw a single bowl on the wheel, taking my time, focusing on making it as perfect as I could. It was just for me, not for sale or for a show. Just a bowl to commemorate this moment. I threw it thin and light with a delicate rim that curved just so. After it dried, I carved a simple date into the bottom, the date of the symposium, the date when my story officially became bigger than just me. I glazed the bowl in a deep blue, my favorite glaze, one that broke to lighter shades over the carved lines and pooled darker in the crevices. When it came out of the kiln a week later, it was exactly what I had envisioned, a quiet, beautiful object that held meaning beyond its function. That bowl sits on a shelf in my living room now, a reminder of everything that happened and everything I learned. Sometimes visitors ask about it, and I tell them the abbreviated version of the story. Other times I just look at it myself, remembering. The years continued to pass peacefully. My pottery business grew steadily but remained a side endeavor, supplementing my day job income, but never replacing it. That was fine with me. I liked the balance, the intellectual challenge of software development during the day, and the physical, creative satisfaction of pottery in the evenings and weekends. Helen Morris served 3 terms as HOA president before stepping down, and she was replaced by another reasonable person who continued her sensible approach to managing the neighborhood. The covenants that Helen had revised remained in effect, explicitly protecting home-based businesses and creative work. Meadowbrook Hills became known in the area as an HOA that actually functioned the way HOAs should, maintaining common standards while respecting individual rights. I never saw or heard from Patricia Donnelly again. I occasionally wondered what happened to her, whether she learned anything from the experience or simply moved on to terrorize some other neighborhood. But mostly, I did not think about her at all. She had taken up enough of my mental energy during those difficult years, and I refused to give her any more. What I thought about instead was the work, the endless exploration of form and glaze, the satisfaction of opening the kiln to find successful pieces, the joy of seeing someone's face light up when they held one of my mugs for the first time. That was what mattered, not the drama or the conflict, but the quiet act of making things with care and intention. My story did not have a dramatic ending with villains punished and heroes rewarded. Patricia faced no real consequences beyond resigning from the HOA board and moving away. I received no compensation for the year of stress and lost income, though the voided fines and the HOA paying Marcus Chen's fees provided some financial relief. The victory was simply the right to continue doing what I had been doing all along, making pottery in my garage studio. But sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the victory is just the continuation of ordinary life, the preservation of the simple freedoms that we take for granted until someone tries to take them away. The right to pursue a passion, to create, to use your own property for lawful purposes, these are not dramatic rights, but they matter deeply to the people who exercise them. Now, when I turn on my kiln and hear that familiar hum, I think about all the other kilns and workshops and studios humming away in garages and basements across Arizona and beyond. I think about all the people making art and furniture and ceramics and music in their homes, pursuing their passions, expressing their creativity, and living richer lives because of it. Patricia tried to silence one kiln, but she inadvertently helped protect thousands of others. The legal precedent from my case, the publicity around the story, the legislative attention it helped generate, all of that made it harder for future HOA boards to arbitrarily shut down legitimate home-based creative work. That kiln in my garage, the one that Patricia ordered shut down for good, still fires regularly. It has probably fired over 100 times since Judge Sullivan's decision. It has transformed thousands of pounds of clay into ceramic, created countless mugs and bowls and plates that people use every day in their homes. And it will keep firing, keep humming, keep transforming, because sometimes when you stand up and fight for what is right, you actually win. The art studio permit that proved Patricia dead wrong now hangs framed on the wall of my studio, next to the city permits and the electrical inspection certificate. It is not displayed out of spite, but as a reminder that authority must always be balanced against individual rights, that rules must be applied fairly and reasonably, and that creativity deserves protection and respect. My kiln hums in my garage tonight as I write this, firing a load of bowls and mugs that will come out tomorrow morning transformed by heat and chemistry into something permanent and beautiful. The neighborhood is quiet around me, people living their lives, pursuing their own passions in their own ways. And somewhere out there, I hope there is someone standing in their own studio, fighting their own battle against an unreasonable HOA, and finding the courage to keep going because they heard about my case and learned that standing up for yourself is not only possible, but necessary. That is the real ending to this story, not the court decision or Patricia's resignation, but the ongoing work, the clay spinning on the wheel, the kiln transforming earth into art, and the quiet satisfaction of doing what you love in the space you created for it. Patricia tried to shut down my kiln for good, but she failed. The kiln still burns, the wheel still spins, and the work continues exactly as it should.